Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to It's Time for More Injury Funding, the podcast for all who want to learn about legal funding and its significance in personal injury, workers' compensation, civil litigation, medical malpractice, dog bites, and many other types of law practice domains. I'm your host, Laura, founder and CEO of More Injury Funding, the legal funding counselors with passion for law, legal funding and heart for all suffering individuals. More Injury Funding is a sponsor, member, associate, a board member, or business partner of this podcast, Georgia Trial Lawyers Association, Academy of Truck Accident Attorneys, Georgia Association for Women Lawyers, or GAL, Sandy Springs Bar Association, Georgia Association of Paralegals, Atlanta Legal Aid Society, State Bar of Georgia, San Andrew Rowing Club, and Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. In today's episode, I have a special guest with me today, Mark Dayman, managing partner of BW Arpeggio LLC Strategic Valuation and Advisory Services. Mark leverages his 40 plus years of experience helping clients with litigation support in the areas of commercial damages, eminent domain, IP, and you can explain what IP is later on, Mark, family law, and franchisee disputes. Among the industries he has worked with, the most include real estate, hospitality, franchisees, and the franchisee business model, and technology, among others. Today, we'll focus our attention on how business value can impact the outcome of disputes. And at the end of our episode, I'll have one pop-up question, so stay tuned in. Welcome to This Time for More Injury Funding podcast.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate
the
opportunity to be here.
So tell us a little bit, Mark, about your company. It sounds, it sounds like a top secret institution because of such a complex name. Can you please decipher it for us, what this name stands for, and what is it that your company does?
Actually, the name's been around for a long time. It's really used in music more than anything, but one of our great goals is clarity. Working with clients on a whole variety of questions, and that always involves making sure we take a look at everything in order to reach a valid conclusion, and that's that step process that is also arpeggio outside of the musical instrument. We are a consulting company that was really formed a couple of years ago through a merger of a couple of other companies, one that I had and another one that I was aware of and had an opportunity to merge together. We provide C-level advisory services, but beyond that, and particularly with respect to the work that I do, tends to be very much focused on litigation support, helping attorneys and their clients try to identify what's been lost, where did it go, what it was worth, that type of an issue. And we're going to talk about valuation today, and valuation is one component of that type of work.
Okay. And you had mentioned that a large part of your business consists of litigation support and forensics. Tell us about that.
Well, we're in a world of disputes. No matter what happens, people just, they can't have trouble getting along. We live in a world of agreements, whether they're oral or in writing. Well-defined, even in writing. I'll tell you quite honestly, we think we've figured out all of the twists and turns, and they don't always work out that way. And so disputes do arise, and it's in those situations when normally there's a financial element to those disputes. Not always, but frequently, at least, if not normally. And valuation may be one of the solutions, or one of the questions on the table is, what was something worth at a time, or how did it change in value, that kind of thing. So that's what leads us into that part of dispute resolution.
Mm-hmm. And most of your time you spend in litigation support, Mark.
Yes.
That is commercial disputes and damages, owner disputes, IP, eminent domain, and family law. What is IP and what is eminent domain? These are kind of secretive words to me.
Yeah, those are secrets. IP is intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
Most businesses today are so much different than they were 100 years ago. 100 years ago, it was brick and mortar. And those companies still exist, by the way. I don't want to make it sound as if they don't. But even in those companies, the real value of those businesses goes with the intellectual property, trade names, concepts, technology that they have, the people that they have. So a lot of disputes today relate to the legal rights that people have with respect to intellectual property. And again, it comes down to this issue of disputes. Somebody might have taken it, might be using it inappropriately. Whole host of issues arise with the use of IP, and it's an area that we get involved in.
And I know you spend quite a bit of time in courts as expert witness.
Yes.
So as a qualified expert witness, you work within several state courts, the U.S. District Court and Bankruptcy Court across the country. But you're primarily focused on the Southeast, is that correct?
Yeah, it really is. I would say that most of our work is east of the Mississippi and south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Okay.
But because of the work that we do, both myself and my colleagues, we tend to work anywhere in the country where the need arises.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about your expert witness role. What does it entail, and how often do you get to testify in courts?
That's an interesting question. It's a matter of telling a story. And I'll be honest with you, I've heard people say that it's really about theater, and I think to some degree, to a large degree, it is. It's really a message. It's a communication of a concept to people, candidly, who are generally not sophisticated in finance.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a matter of communicating how somebody was financially injured and what the amount of that injury might have been financially, without doing it in such a way that is so confusing that people's eyes glaze over. That's the last thing you want. And although it's always a concern if it's a jury trial, bench trials tried by a judge really are the same thing. Most people who are in law are not necessarily well trained in finance, and occasionally we just when we're preparing to go into court, we're very cautious about getting a handle on who's going to be listening to us. Mm-hmm. And we tailor what is conceptually very complex. We have to make it fairly simple. Let somebody ask more questions if they want. Start out asking or responding to stuff as straightforward and at a high level as you possibly can. But it is theater.
Very interesting. I love that. Let's shift our focus now to disputes. What role do valuations play in business disputes?
When we have disputes that come to us, and they may literally be not litigation at that point, but just people who have disagreements about value, and there can be a number of things that could be addressed. One of them that deals with forensics, which we're not going to get into today. That really is a whole specialty that we have. But when you come down to what did we lose or where did it go, it could be a question of, for example, lost profits that we're looking at. But there's another measure of damages in some cases where it's a question of what was it worth, or what was it worth at one time? What is it worth now? What did we lose in terms of value? That's where business valuation comes in. So business valuation can be used in all sorts of things unrelated to litigation, and it is all the time. From my point of view, sometimes we need to measure value in order to determine what somebody lost or how that should be restored.
Mm-hmm. That totally makes sense. How can attorneys impact the value of a business in terms of potential legal risks or liabilities, or can they at all?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to how attorneys write agreements. I'm not sure that we'll get into it, but a type of agreement which is very common and frequently causes problems are shareholder agreements and limited liability agreements that have provisions dealing with what happens if somebody wants to get in or get out of a business. If those agreements are not well constructed, it is not uncommon, in spite of everybody believing they had this figured out, it's not uncommon for somebody to say, yeah, but that's not quite the way we look at this. Mm-hmm. The circumstances are a little bit different. And as a result of that, it gets people talking about why they don't want to necessarily follow what the agreement said.
Mhm.
And that can get very heated. And sometimes it ends up in formal litigation, sometimes ends up in court.
Okay. Does it ever end up in physical fight?
Fisticuffs? Not that I'm aware of. I've actually been doing this for a long time and I haven't had to deal with that yet.
Thankfully.
Yeah, but I dodged that bullet, I guess. Literally.
I love it. How does the current economic climate or industry trends affect the valuation of a business?
Well, that's another good question. I'll tell you this. Valuation is a prophecy of the future. Really is. We're not being asked to buy or sell something. We're telling litigants, could be telling a court, that this is what it would be worth under certain circumstances of a transaction. And I've always kind of followed this path that it's really a prophecy of the future. One of the important notations there is that value is not based on what happened yesterday. Value is based on what we think is going to happen tomorrow, and it's not unique to private companies. Your IBM stock is valued based on what people think that company is going to do next year. And the same thing really is true in private companies as well. And that's part of where the difficulty comes on how economics and demographics impact where a company is going to go from the last time it was reported to where it's going to go in the next 5 years. So economic and demographic factors dramatically impact it. Let me just say one other thing about that. In addition to being a prophecy of the future, valuation really comes down to two broad factors. One is the economic benefits, my apologies, that we think we're going to get in the future. Mm-hmm. And the other one is risk. It's almost like a mathematical formula. Those two factors come into play. And the combination of the two, when measured by people, whoever they may be, gives rise to what their perception of value is. And we're no different. That's how we come up with value. Now, I just reduced into 50 words what takes hours to work on, and a lot of research and economics and demographics go into it as well. But in very simplistic terms, but very accurate terms, that's what it comes down to: economic benefits and risk.
Very interesting. Have you by any chance figured out that formula?
I use it all the time.
You use it all the time.
That's what they pay us for, is to try to figure out what those two factors are.
That's mesmerizing what you do. Absolutely it is. Are there any specific due diligence steps that should be taken to assess potential legal risk related to disputes when valuing a business?
Well, that comes down to doing the right job. Due diligence comes into play a lot when people are buying and selling a business, especially if they're a buyer. They should go through a significant amount of due diligence to make sure that every rock has been turned over. They have clear understanding of what they're buying. That's another area of disputes that we get involved in quite a bit, by the way, are deals where the rocks were not turned over adequately. And everybody says it was your fault, and that creates a whole section of disputes that we get involved in, deals that go bad, we call them. But in terms of litigation work, we go through our own due diligence that we need to do, both in terms of the credibility of the attorneys that we work with in client situations, to make sure that we're going to be able to provide valuable services to the client that we're working with. Our job in litigation ordinarily is objectivity, clarity and objectivity. Courts don't want us to come in and be an advocate for one side or the other. They're looking for fairness. There are times when we're hired as a consultant for a firm. We're not going to be an expert witness. They want to know how to strategically play the case out for the advantage of their own client. In terms of due diligence and standards, we all have standards we have to follow. And it requires that we obtain significant amount of information, a lot of it from the litigants, and a lot of it, as I said before, from economic and demographic information that's widely available in the public domain. Mm-hmm. In fact, to be honest with you, it's amazing what we're getting off a computer, and we're only starting to learn how the current trends in AI are impacting that.
That's another amazing story to me. What strategies can be implemented to mitigate legal risk related to personal injury claims and enhance the overall accuracy of the value of a business?
Well, I'm not sure I would address this necessarily personal injury, but from a dispute point of view, I think there's the clarity in people's understanding of what they're getting into is an issue. In a number of fields that we're involved in, franchising is a great one to talk about. We could spend hours talking about that one. We do a lot of work in franchising, and disputes arise because it is an extreme contractual business. I don't think I've ever seen a business model that is so tied to the contracts between a franchise, a brand, and the store owners. And the opportunity for disagreements are immense, but what the real confusion is that people didn't understand necessarily what they were signing, what the terms were. And I think beyond franchising, that's true in a lot of disputes, is that there wasn't a clear meeting of the minds about what people were going to get themselves into. Some of those, I think, could be solved through better writing of agreements. Sometimes they're not even written. And in most states, when it comes to commercial companies, LLCs and corporations, partnerships too, there's some uniform laws that states adopt. So if you haven't written down what you're going to do among yourselves and agree to it, almost every state has a series of laws that govern how transactions, disputes, management of the business is going to be operated. And you might not like that. You probably will not like that. Mm-hmm. It's designed to be fairly universal, and in the worst case, this is how we're going to do it. And it's interesting, some of the twists and turns you run into. They may be totally different than what you had intended to do.
Can that happen within one state in different counties? Can different counties in one particular state have different laws, or is it usually nationwide? I mean, is it more statewide law?
Usually it's statewide. I don't think I've ever seen counties define that, but I'm not an attorney, and there may well be some counties that have broad enough brush that they're able to do that. It might be true, especially if those counties tax based on income. Mm-hmm. We don't have that here in Georgia. But some places, cities and towns actually have an income tax. Generally, it's state law that drives it. Yeah, there's some things that are from a federal point of view too, but it's one of those rights that have been left to the states to manage.
That makes sense. How can attorneys assist in negotiating the purchase or sale of a business, particularly in terms of indemnification clauses or liability protections?
That's where these deals get in trouble. It all comes down to how the contract is worded. And, well, let me step back. There are two things. Yeah, it's how the contracts are put together for a deal, but the other side of it is how much due diligence was done by the buyer or the seller, by the way, sometimes. And whether that work was adequate enough to assure that we really understand what's going on in the deal. A purchase and sales agreement today, even for relatively small businesses, can be a huge document covering so many different factors, because I think buyers and sellers in the legal profession have learned that there are a lot of ways that things can go sideways in the deal. It's a matter of careful scripting of those documents and making sure that everybody has turned over the rocks that need to be looked at. Invariably, that fails in a number of cases that I've seen. One of the other areas that can be helpful, although it's not so much so on smaller businesses, but when you start to get into, and I'm not talking public transactions now, but even larger private transactions, you actually can insure those risks that something is not the way you think they are, that some transaction fault will occur that people weren't counting on, and so they will insure those risks today. It's become fairly common. Mm-hmm.
how does the concept of risk play into valuing a business?
But I mentioned before that the secret, we shouldn't let this out. The secret is to understand what economic benefits are in a business going forward, and people's expectation of risk. And that's a slippery one. It's easier sometimes to identify the economic benefits than it is to identify risk. But the question that ultimately gets posed is, if I've got a certain economic benefit stream that I think I'm going to have, what is the likelihood? What are the risks associated with that benefit stream? And particularly, what are the risks that I'm not going to get what I thought I was going to have? And we have a number of tools that we can use to measure it, to quantify that risk, because ultimately you got to figure out how to quantify it. But we do have tools that we can use, and it comes into play again in that equation. What the benefit stream is. What is the likelihood that we're actually going to see that? What are the risks that are going to upset our expectation of that cash flow? It's often referred to, the risk is often measured in terms of, people might call it return on investment or return of investment, cost of equity, cost of capital. Those are all measurements of risk that we get involved.
What are some key considerations for prospective buyers or sellers when assessing the potential legal risks, contingencies, and the unknown in the valuation process?
What we normally recommend, and I think attorneys do too, as a matter of course, although people again think that due diligence is really a financial question, and it does, especially when something goes wrong, it comes down to financial issues. But there's a whole area in due diligence that really falls on the attorneys. In fact, most law firms have enormous due diligence checklists of their own that are very specific about the legal risks that are associated with buying and selling a business, and they go through an enormous amount of work to tie down their end of it. We certainly recommend that always take place. The other side of it, though, I don't mean to oversimplify this. It is making sure that buyers, in particular buyers, understand what they're buying in terms of the business, and prove to themselves that what they've been told, or what appears to be true on one level, is something that can be proven out. There are times when, no matter what you do, there are contingencies involved in a business that you just can't quantify very easily. Loss of customers, loss of personnel. There could even be leftover litigation tied to the business, especially if the transaction was a stock transaction rather than assets. Buyers always try to walk away from as many of those obligations of the seller as you possibly can. Sometimes you can't. And when that gets done, it really comes down again to how the deal is scripted, because there are ways to throw the risk back on the seller, keeping clearly in mind that sometimes, you're going to make an assumption that if something goes wrong, the seller said he'd cover it or she'd cover it. And the reality is, you can't be sure that it's going to take place. Things go wrong. Or disputes revolve about whether that really was something we agreed to cover. I mean, those types of questions arise all the time. It's one of the reasons why you get involved in litigation involving deals that have gone bad, both before and after, by the way, transaction closes. Sometimes you just can't monetize those risks very well. Sometimes you can insure them, but sometimes you just can't. And the seller is usually asked to absorb that responsibility. If they said X, turns out to be Y, they have the right to go back and make an adjustment to the deal.
I'm sure it happens that
if the seller's still around.
If the seller's still around.
Yeah, there's the problem.
Oh, that was so great again, Mark. Thank you so much again about talking with us about how business value can impact the income. But before I let you go, as promised, I have one pop-up question for you.
Sure.
You ready, Mark?
Go for it.
Okay. What is something about you that would surprise people to learn?
although this sounds a little weird, I'm one of these people that enjoys the wilderness. And give me a week in the wilderness to rebuild. It's better than any other place, actually, for me.
How often do you get to go to the nature?
Well, as often as I can. At least once a year I go. In fact, I'm heading in July, actually, this year.
That's amazing. Where are you going to?
Wyoming.
Wyoming. Okay.
Yeah, there's a spot in Wyoming that I always go back to.
Can't wait to see those pictures and videos.
I got a lot of them already from before. Yeah,
That's wonderful.
that is good.
So, Mark, that was amazing time spent with you. Thanks so much again for joining our podcast at Sign for More Injury Funding. But before I let you go, tell us how people can reach you. How can they reach you? And if they need your services. Do you have a website, social media resources, platforms?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, that's one way to get a hold of me. My telephone number, although I have an office phone too, obviously my cell is 678-662-6478. You can always call me. And people always do. I'm using my cell phone, so don't feel embarrassed about that. My email is mdayman, D-A-Y-M-A-N, mdayman@bradyware.com. And our webpage is bwarpeggio.com. Get a hold of us all those ways.
I love it. Again, that was Mark Dayman, a managing partner of BW Arpeggio LLC, Strategic Valuation and Advisor Services. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for watching and listening to our episode today. For more tips and tricks on legal funding and personal injury related topics, follow me, download, like, and subscribe to the Sign for More Injury Funding podcast on several podcast platforms worldwide, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and all others. And follow me on More Injury Funding on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, Pinterest, YouTube, Google Business Profile, and my website at moreinjuryfunding.com. That's with 2 O's. I can't wait to hear and listen from you again soon. Until then, be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Good talk.